Good evening, anarchists everywhere. I'm Ian Bone and welcome to Anarchism in the UK, where I interview ageing but growing old disgracefully London anarchists. Today I'm joined by one who has led a thoroughly disgraceful life from start till now. London autonomist, class warrior, pugilist and polemicist, Martin Wright. Welcome, Martin.
Hello, everybody.
Can you tell us a bit about your early life?
Yes, indeed. I was brought up around the Angel, Islington, a very rough place of tenements, a bit like a film noir background, really. Tough bars and pubs and dance halls and so on. That's what it looked like. A lot of poverty, Chapel Market, terrible place. A lot of people didn't have baths, outdoor toilets, no hot water. That was a normal situation. 20,000 on the waiting list. Schools were crap. Brutal places where you were caned, belted, slapped, tweaked by the teachers. And that was basically the education. That's what it consisted of.
Against that background, how did you discover anarchism? How did you come across anarchist ideas?
Well, I think I must have been a natural anarchist because I rebelled. By the age of 7, I had a vision on the road to Damascus, if you like, when I was about to have my first communion, and I decided to reject it all, although I had to do it inwardly, silently, otherwise the Torquemada punishments would have been too much for me. So I was against the education that they gave me, and I was against the parental authority that I had, and it kind of started from there. I first declared myself to be an anarchist, I think, when I was about 13 in a discussion in the school. I'd confused anarchism with republicanism. I wanted to see the Queen and the royal family all executed and guillotined, and I thought that's what an anarchist was. The teacher said, no, that's republicanism. Anarchism means no law and order, no rules, no regulations, people just doing exactly what they like. The rest of the class, well, that sounds terrible, but I thought, oh yeah, some distinct possibilities there. I quite like the sound of that, although I would say that it wasn't until I was about 16 that I had a really good idea of what anarchism really was as a historical movement and as an ideology.
And where did you discover that there were other anarchists about and there was an ideology? What did you find or read or hear about?
I started reading about it in the underground magazines that used to come out in those days, International Times and Oz in particular, had a lot of anarchist type things in them. I suppose that's where I really started to learn about it. And when I was about 16, 17, I started going down to Speaker's Corner, which is a lot different in those days from what it is now in the 1969, 1970, very different. And there was a lot of anarchists there. There was a lot of anarchist ideas floating around, and I met anarchists. I was probably the youngest one of them all, but I'd say that I was fully fledged anarchist by the time I was 17, by about 1970, halfway through 1970.
And did that lead you on to read the holy texts of Kropotkin, Bakunin, Proudhon and so on?
I read a lot. But I do read a lot. I quite like Bakunin, Kropotkin, Proudhon. I found them somewhat staid. Good turn of phrase here and there. But I enjoyed reading about the anarchist movements of the past. The Martinovists, for example. I read a copy of The Unknown Revolution when I was quite young, and I was quite impressed by the Martinovists. I was quite impressed by the Spanish anarchists. I wouldn't really recommend the sacred texts of anarchism to anybody. Any sacred text is boring, but I would recommend people to read about regional anarchist movements, historical anarchist movements. Very interesting, well worth reading.
And what was your first actual action that you went on with other anarchists?
I think the first big action I went with other anarchists was the 1970 protest against the American invasion of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. There was quite a few anarchists there, and I particularly went with them because, well, I would have called myself an anarchist more or less by then, but I was quite sympathetic to the Maoists, but that was only because they were extremely violent. But the anarchists were extremely violent, but quite clever about it as well. The Maoists got nicked, the anarchists didn't.
Yeah, the Maoists always wore white crash helmets, as I remember, which seemed to get pretty noticeable. And then I think one of the big things early on was the anti-National Front march in Lewisham, which must have been a sort of...
Yes, I'd got interested in anti-fascism just by meeting lots of fascists, strangely enough, down in Hyde Park, but also the Enoch Powell and Powellism and racism was pretty big in the workplace and on the street level, so you had to argue against it every day. when the fascists did start to get big and organised and march on the streets, which would be about 1973, 74, I started getting interested in opposing them. I was naturally anti-fascist, anti-racist anyway, right? But I did see it as perhaps as a forerunner of maybe more serious clashes on the streets that were to come. Lewisham 1977, I think, was really like a big turning point in the political history of this country. Very important it was. National Front got smashed on the streets, and the police for the first time had to employ riot shields. I mean, it's our national disgrace that the police had to employ riot shields in 1977 rather than 1968. But it was from then that things really took off, and I think that the anti-fascist struggles were a good prelude to the urban riots that took place in the early 80s.
And who was doing the fighting at Lewisham? Was it the ordinary punters on the street, or was it politicos? Or
it was local people, that is to say black people, and predominantly, but also a lot of white people as well, that opposed the National Front and opposed the National Party and the racist movements they were at that time, and a lot of lefties as well. I think it was a big thing for a lot of lefties. It went beyond, you know, the sort of rigid ideology of their party. They got to fight the police. It was quite exciting. They actually managed to actually do something to accomplish something almost spontaneously.
And do you think the sort of that confrontation on the streets, a la Cable Street and Lewisham, actually contributed to the decline of the NF at that time?
Oh, most definitely so, yeah. They were getting a bit too big for their boots, but they were able, thanks to massive police protection, to assemble and march on the streets. After that, it was more and more difficult for them. They really got a pasting that day. That was the beginning of the decline for them.
I guess the follow-on from that would be the Brixton riot and then the 1981 riots. What did you make of those?
Oh, I thought, yes, well, obviously, I was very, very enthusiastic about them. I was quite surprised that hadn't occurred earlier, actually. There was, this country seemed to be very, very slow in catching up with things, but once we did catch up with things, then, yeah, they were extremely violent and extremely anti-police, anti-authority. They could have gone along a lot further. If Thatcher had been in power for a couple of years, they could have become more politicised, but they were, but not in the way I'd like to see them. I'd like to see them become more insurrectionary. Although in Totstell they did actually become insurrectionary, but never realised any political demands. The left, of course, thought it was all about unemployment and things like that. It wasn't. It was about everything. It was about the police. It was about the crap education, standard of living, quality of life, just being at the bottom of the pile. And the riots of the 1980s were not just black people or Asian people. They were black, white and Asian. They were working class people, working class youth in particular, but whole communities as well, in an uprising against the system.
That's one of the key problems of our brand of anarchism, is how do you turn riot into insurrection? I mean, how could that have gone any further? It might be in the realms of fantasy, but can you see ways which things could have been pushed a bit further?
Well, yes, because in those days the left always stepped in. If anarchists have had a bit more confidence, I mean, for example, I'll give a very quick example. In Brixton in 1981, a lot of people were arrested, and there was a general movement on the streets that these people should have an amnesty, and there was a threat to march on the police station to demand an amnesty. Now, the Labour Party, who were kind of left in those days, and the left in general, stepped in and said, oh, no, we don't want anything like that. It could lead to further trouble. And the Labour lefts were all shouting, oh, it's against the British Constitution to have an amnesty and so on. Now, the so-called community leaders went along with this because obviously they didn't want to lose their position in the community to the insurrectionary youth. The anarchists at the time, rather than wanking off about what they did in the riots or didn't do in the riots, should have organised, should have stepped in and say, yeah, we believe in the amnesty, we want to push it forward, we'll march on the police station, we support the youth. But of course, as always, we went so far, but we couldn't go any further.
Yeah, I think it often happens, so that leaves the field open to sort of lefty community leaders to articulate the kind of rubbish reasons for the revolt, as you mentioned, like jobs and playing ping pong with the vicar and this, that and the other.
Yeah, I mean, the insurrections that occurred had absolutely nothing to do with jobs. I mean, obviously, a lot of the youth were unemployed, but there was millions of unemployed then anyway. So it had virtually nothing to do with jobs. The jobs were so shitty paid anyway that it would make you even more insurrectionary, even more angry to be living on £20 or £30 a week in those days. that would make you even more insurrectionary, even more angry to be living on £20 or £30 a week in those days.
Well, yeah, I think that the right to work's not a great slogan. Are you keen on the dignity of labour?
No, as Oscar Wilde said, there's nothing dignified about standing in a prevailing wind for 4 hours, sort of sweeping the shit in the gutters. He said, don't talk to me about the nobility of labour, and I have done that for 10 years. I had a job doing that, cleaning the streets. I know exactly what it means. There's nothing dignified about it at all. I mean, the right to work is really the left saying, oh, the right for the proletariat to work in daddy's factories.
Then in the sort of, after the riots in the early 80s, class war came upon the scene, both as a newspaper and a movement. What did you think of Class War, the newspaper?
Well, as I was involved in it, I thought it was absolutely brilliant, right? And Class War as a newspaper, Class War as a newspaper and Class War as a movement came out against a background of industrial struggle, mass riots on the streets and so on in the urban centres that we were talking about earlier on. I mean, for example, I can remember the big public service demonstrations where hundreds of thousands of workers, myself included, being a worker at that time, went on strike. Basically had these big marches in central London to try and influence government policy. Not that we really believed that we could do it, but we used to sell Class War, and I remember distinctly, one of my best memories ever was having a copy of the Class War with a Chaz and Di and their baby and the words "another f***ing royal parasite," and like literally dozens, if not hundreds of people actually queuing up to buy it, all dressed up in their nurses' uniforms, firemen's uniforms with their local council caps on and so on. Yeah, it was a great buzz, and it was like that all the time. I'd say that Class War was a really great buzz, and I think we were like perhaps a really good representatives of the anger of the time.
I mean, one of the problems with anarchist newspapers has always been breaking out of the anarchist ghetto, so to speak. And I think Class War did show that it was possible to develop a mass circulation paper. I mean, do you think that's still a possibility these days?
I think everything's wide open. I think it is a possibility, and I think there's a possibility to progress in other medias as well. Radio, television, I don't see why we shouldn't do stuff like that. I mean, the net's a big thing, but I'm not really into the net. It seems to isolate people, but radio, television, more papers, yeah, sure.
I think people hear about Class War selling lots of newspapers and they think you just went on the street and they all sold out in half an hour, but it was hard work, wasn't it, Martin?
Well, it was hard work, but, you can keep going when people are buying hundreds. You're not standing there like someone from the socialist worker outside Sainsbury's being assaulted by little old ladies with umbrellas, not selling a single thing, dumping them in the bin afterwards and paying for it out of your own wages. No.
And then the miners' strike in 85 and the real, Thatcher's assault on the working class. Do you think there was a way the miners' strike could have been won? Yes,
but in two ways. First of all, it sounds rather sort of revisionist and so on, or whatever you want to call it, but I definitely think if the TUC had called a general strike, it would have been over in a week one way or another, and that would have been it. I think also if there was a general strike, I think the opportunities for pushing it a lot further would have been there, but perhaps that's why they didn't do it. Who knows?
Yeah, and do you think, what about the role of Class War and anarchists in the strike? Do you think there's some things we could have pushed further there, or do you think we did as much as the resources allowed?
I think we did as much as we could. Although if there had been urban riots like there was in 1981, for example, alongside the miners' strike, if both had run simultaneously, then I think that the government would have been in real trouble. I think that it would have probably given us it would have probably taken us to a sort of semi-insurrectionist state for a while.
Yeah, I've always regretted that Broadwater Farm and Brixton went up 6 months after the end of the miners' strike. If they'd happened during the miners' strike, it's difficult to see how the police would have had enough manpower to police the coalfields, inner city areas.
They would have had to have employed the armed forces, and can you imagine them having soldiers on the streets? I mean, that is a surefire sign that things are not going well for the government when they've got soldiers on the streets. I mean, that would have made a real impact on people's minds.
I mean, our brand of anarchism has often been called the sort of street insurrectionary brand of anarchism, and there's a quote from you from Class War at the time: "We must go out with a paper in one hand and a brick in the other." Do you think that insurrectionary brand of anarchism these days is still as possible it was against the sort of naked class warrior Thatcher in the 80s?
I think that's what it will come down to in the end. Let's face it. That's what it comes down to always, doesn't it? Every social movement always goes out onto the streets and so on. There's always extremely, if I dare to use the word, violent, like barricades, looting of shops, seizure of buildings. That's what it's all about. That's what anarchism's partly about. It's about revolution.
Can you sort of capture the sheer joy, enthusiasm and adrenaline rush of being in a riot for people who've never been there? Because it's not just a political thing, it is a sort of buzz and rush.
Oh, it most certainly is, but I don't want to make it sound like a really interesting sexual experience. Although I suppose it could be compared to the best sex you've ever had, but we're not all in, not everybody's into brawling and fighting and throwing petrol bombs and raising barricades and so on.
Do you think the present economic crisis is presenting opportunities to anarchists which maybe didn't exist 4 or 5 weeks ago in the way things are going?
Yes, I see it over a longer period of time, perhaps a year, perhaps 2 years. The system can stabilise itself. There's no reason why it can't, but it does look to be in a bit of trouble. I mean, so far it's people losing their jobs in banks and so on, and subsidiary industries, personal industries as well. People that walk their dogs, their nannies and so on. All these people are going to lose their jobs as well. But I think it would require all the banks to collapse, the entire stock market to collapse. It's being shored up quite ably, I think, at the moment. But it could break loose. It could, like a dam, it could just break and just go. It has done before. There's no reason why it couldn't now.
Of course, other fish swim in this pool of discontent, like the BNP and so on. How do you view the sort of the slow but sure rise of the BNP of late?
With alarm. I think the BNP basically do pick up their support from the white working class. They're not picking up their support from the middle class. If the middle class started to support them, as the middle class historically have supported fascism, like in Hitler's Germany, for example, I think we'd be in real trouble. What pisses me off, what I don't like so much, is the fact that the very people that the BNP are attracting, alienated white working class people, are the sort of people that should be interested in anarchism, interested in insurrection. It's only because the BNP are the only alternative in a lot of places that people flock to the BNP. If there were better anarchist alternatives, I'm absolutely sure that a lot of people would come over to us instead. But we're small, we're elitist even, very ghetto orientated. We don't want to go out on the streets. We don't want to be a mass movement. It's almost like some sort of heresy. But that's what we should be aiming for, and I think that is the best way to fight the BNP. Although, of course, I am in favour of physically opposing the BNP, but you've got to remember they don't actually march out on the streets anymore, so it makes them difficult to combat.
I think some of the left's been a bit slow on the uptake of that the BNP has totally changed. They're not out with their sort of street goon squads anymore, so opposing them politically is more difficult maybe than it was.
Yes, but that's opposing them politically is to build up a viable, non-authoritarian, non-hierarchical, street-fighting, anarchist class war type scenario. That's what I oppose the BNP with. I wouldn't oppose the BNP with liberalism or vote for the Liberal Democrat candidate in the council election, keep out the BNP. That's not the sort of politics I'm in.
Which brings us on to the state of the modern anarchist movement. In the last sort of 10 years or so, anarchism seems to be defined as much more of a lifestyle option of a dog on a string, of a vegan, of what clothes you wear, what fashion you like, what music you listen to. What's your take on the sort of, the state of the anarchist movement at the moment in England?
No, I think it's pretty dire, but it has been pretty dire for quite some time, even when I was like a youth of 16, 17. I find that the anarchists here, not really what I would call anarchists, a lot of them, I find them to be extreme liberals, left communists, pacifists, not anarchists. I think that's a big thing as well. A lot of what we think is the anarchist movement is something else, except it's using anarchism as a label of convenience. I think that's a big thing as well. A lot of what we think is the anarchist movement is something else, except it's using anarchism as a label of convenience.
I mean, what passes as the green anarchist movement to me seems barely distinguishable from the sort of toffs of the Tory party and the Zach Goldsmiths, and the climate camp seems a sort of a blind alley where lots of anarchists are rushing down, and very soon, within a couple of years, you can see them being co-opted into the Tory party.
Yes, it's all very like noble and everything like that, along with third worldism. But I think we should be interested in ecology, but ecology for me is a quality of life, being able to afford food, to have a decent roof over your head, to have a decent standard of living, not to breathe in crap when you're walking around, to be able to work without sort of suffering illness for it and so on, for having a good feeling, a good mentality, well-being and so on. That's what ecology is to me. It's the ecology, the standards, the everyday life. That's what ecology is to me, not sort of stopping the proles from jetting off to cheap holidays or driving bangers. That's not what it's about.
You're doing a talk at the Anarchist Book Fair on October the 18th. What's the title of the talk?
The title of the talk, as far as I remember, is juxtaposition of Bougainville, Bogota, Bolivia, or Blackburn, Bermondsey, and Bolton, or something like that anyway.
That's pretty good.
Counterposing, saying like that the activists, the anarchists, a lot of them are more concerned with what's going on thousands of miles away than they are here in their own backyard. And I actually think that, laudable though it is to show solidarity with people in struggle abroad, that we should be struggling here, and anything that we do here has great repercussions abroad. If we could pull off an insurrection or a revolutionary, or even create a revolutionary situation or be part of a revolutionary situation here, that does more for the people in Bolivia and Venezuela or anywhere than us standing outside the embassy or like having film shows about struggles in places thousands of miles away.
Why do you think it is that so many anarchists are keen to show solidarity with people thousands of miles away who don't even talk to their neighbours on the estates where they live? It seems a peculiar sort of vision of...
It's part of the lifestyle thing, isn't it? It's safe, isn't it? It's safe to support sort of armed struggle 2 or 3 or 4 or 5,000 miles away. Very safe indeed. But it's not so safe, is it? Like, you know, to talk about your ideas at work or to your neighbours, or like even to organise on your estate or at work. Oh, that's not very safe at all. I think it's safe, and it's also part of a scene, isn't it? Our scene is dominated, as I say, by liberals who care more about the people suffering thousands of miles away than they do like the millions of people here that live in poverty, have completely alienated, have got absolutely no stake in the society at all.
And what do you think of some of the people they show solidarity with? We're looking, you know, some of the people in South America around Chavez, and there's been solidarity with Cuba, the Zapatistas, even the Sandinistas. What's your take on that?
Well, these basically are lefty movements which always sell out the people, which play power politics, which in the end all these governments will always send out tanks and troops against their own people. They all have prisons where they lock up their own people. When the people themselves break out of the straitjacket of whatever it is the government wishes them to conform to, the government will crush them or attempt to crush them and repress them, as it always does, because that's what governments do.
There's always been sort of supporters of, inverted commas, armed struggle in the anarchist movement in this country, although their support for armed struggle seems to be in inverse relation to anything they actually do. I mean, what do you make of people who sort of eulogise everything from Baader-Meinhof to...
Well, I regard them the same way as the liberals, actually. I don't, you know, this ain't taking up guns and bombs and so on. It's just fantasy wanking off. I mean, we haven't even got the movement. We haven't even had the social background that produced the Red Brigades and the Baader-Meinhofs and so on, you know. We haven't, you know, we haven't got that insurrectionary sort of violent student confrontation with the state type thing that these things arose out of. So, no, to me, it's just another wank. I mean, to put it quite bluntly, you know, we are in the age, or should be in the age, of the brick, the petrol bomb, the bottle and the iron bar, not the barricade, the car on fire, not like sort of bombings and machine gunnings and so on. I believe in mass violence, mass action, not sort of elitist stuff, letting off bombs and so on. I mean, if you let off a bomb, people think you're an Islamic terrorist or an Irish Republican or something like, or even like a Nazi bomber or something like that.
What do you think about, going back to some of the earlier stuff about anarchism as such? I mean, it's a question of, do you believe in anarchism? Do you think anarchism is still a viable political idea?
Yes, you see, I look upon anarchism in two ways. First of all, I look upon anarchism as a historic working class movement, revolutionary, insurrectionist, but also not only that, but anti-authoritarian, quite interested in building up alternatives, avant-garde type things, art movements, and so on. It's a lot of things, but basically, I do see it as a revolutionary idea, and also I believe that in the whole of humanity, in the entire existence of civilization, that there's always been what you might call anarchist currents. You can look at them right through anywhere, right through the Spartacus rebellion, the slaves uprising against the Romans, probably even before that. Rebellions, revolutions that we know nothing about that happened in ancient Egypt or in ancient China and so on, civilizations that have long ceased to be. Also, you've got to remember, as I say, right through to the present day, if you look at the English Revolution, you've got the ranters, the diggers, the fifth monarchists, some of the more extreme levellers, quite approached anarchism in a way. There is always an indigenous, whatever country, whatever society, there's always an indigenous flow of anarchism. Sometimes there's a little stream, sometimes it's a great roaring river.
There seems to be, in English history, a sort of mob tradition of which class war and people like ourselves are part of, going back to the Gordon riots, the Chartists and Captain Swing and peasants and little rick burners. Is that part of the noble working class tradition you see yourself as part of?
Yes, I do. I mean, I live near the Tower of London, and it's very good to know that, like in 1381, that the peasants actually, and during the Peasants' Revolt, that they actually managed to storm the Tower of London, drag out the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chancery Exchequer, and execute them for burdening the population with the poll tax. So yeah, I see myself like as part of that, and I don't only see myself as part of that. I think that it's in everybody's DNA, really, or everybody that's working class, that is.
I know you're one of the great readers of books I've ever come across, Martin. Have you read anything of late which we ought to be reading?
I can't really think of anything. I tell you, I'm not too fond of Chomsky, to tell you the truth. I find it very sleep-inducing. It's a great cure for insomnia. But I actually like the American writer Mike Davis. Although he's not an anarchist and he calls himself a socialist, he writes a lot about anarchism, and he has a very good understanding of class. If you want to look at the modern America, particularly California and the urban metropolises there, and anarchism, socialism, insurrection, read his books. They're very good. I would highly recommend it. I find it that it's very bad. Where are our Mike Davises? Where are our Chomskys even in this country?
One of the things that gets me often is that people just see anarchists as very one-dimensional, as if the only thing they had going on in their lives was an interest in anarchism. But I know you're a great traveller, and that you've travelled throughout vast tracts of the world. Is there anywhere you got your eyes set on now you haven't been before?
Not really. I just like to see the world, but I haven't even seen a lot of this country, and I'd like to visit some more of this country just to see it.
To finish off now, we've got a couple of minutes left. If you could if you seized power in an anarchist collective and you're addressing the nation for the next minute, what would you say to them, Martin?
I'd say something like, great, I've waited years for this, get on with it, and do more, and keep doing it, and don't stop. That's what I'd say, nothing else.
You've just been listening to a broadcast on behalf of the Committee of Public Safety by Brigadier Martin Wright. We have seized power, remain calm, stay in your homes. OK, Martin, that was great. Thanks a lot for that. That was the fifth in a series of interviews on anarchism in the UK. I'll be back next week talking to Tony, the organiser of the Anarchist Book Fair.